There are 14 weapons to choose from, each with their own mechanics and combos that will confuse any new player playing Wilds as their first Monster Hunter game. Now I know there's people with low attention spans, so go ahead and check the timeline so you can skip to your weapon. However, for those that haven't skipped ahead, listen up. Everything that I say is just my own opinion, and I highly recommend using the weapon for yourself to make your own judgment. I don't know how good your gamer skills are, so I'm just making a general assumption. Also, feel free to disagree with what I say, just don't get heated over my ratings. Also, this time we are doing the ratings a bit differently. Before I had to cut out chunks of info, but this time I'm adding a bit more depth to my ratings. Each weapon will have ratings for the mechanics, combos, and an overall difficulty rating. That way you will know what part of the weapon is easy, medium or hard to learn for a beginner. Let's begin with the game's iconic Guts Buster Sword, the Greatsword. The mechanics of this weapon is that it basically has no mechanics, so let's move on. Okay, I'm joking you Greatsword mains. This weapon relies on charging this hunk of metal to deal that fat, chunky damage. Is it hard to charge this weapon? Absolutely not. Which is why this weapon's mechanics are easy. It's really not that difficult to learn. Just charge your attacks for big damage. There is a tiny mechanic of letting go of your charge attack on time to deal more damage, but that's an easy fix. Combos for the Greatsword is weird. Basically, they're not complicated to learn, but there's quite a few links you can do to eventually lead up to your strongest attack. In fact, it feels like you're not really doing combos, and instead you're just making decisions on what your next attack should be, although that is the definition of a combo. Either way, this weapon's combos are easy to learn because it doesn't feel like you're doing a combo. It feels like there's not really a lot of combo strings unless I'm wrong, which means that my overall rating for this weapon is medium. New players might find it difficult to get used to how slow this weapon is, but it doesn't mean that it's hard to use, especially with how this weapon works incredibly well with the focus mode. It makes this weapon's charge attacks really easy to use for a beginner because of the ability to aim your attacks. You no longer need to properly position yourself correctly to land a hit on the monster. As long as you're in the vicinity of the monster, then you'll be able to land your attack. Whereas before, you'd have to be there in the right time and place to land a hit whether it's charged or not. Now, even though the majority of what I said is easy, what makes this weapon go into a medium is the fact that this weapon requires monster knowledge if you intend to time your perfect guards and offset attacks properly. The Dual Blades! Okay, so the mechanics are very simple to learn. Activate Demon Mode, hit the monster until you fill up the bar, and then you no longer need Demon Mode. That's as simple as it gets. So it's fair to say that it's an easy mechanic for a beginner to pick up, which is why I would recommend this weapon as someone's starter weapon. I would be surprised to hear if anyone struggles to understand this weapon's mechanic. The only slight problem that a new player might find annoying is the stamina drain when in Demon Mode. If you don't manage your stamina correctly, you might find yourself in danger. The Dual Blades combos are not very hard to learn. In fact, you probably don't even need to learn them at all. You can pretty much button mash most of the time to deal all the damage you need. This is definitely easy for anyone jumping into this game. I don't have much else to say about the combos. Obviously, knowing which moves to use will help with dealing damage and repositioning, but it doesn't take too long to understand. I guess I'll just admit that I too button mash with this weapon. Overall, this weapon falls under easy. It doesn't take too much to understand how to use the weapon. Maybe if you want to actually learn the combos so you don't button mash too much, but I believe any player would be able to figure out the Dual Blades combos. Even during the heat of combat, it's fairly easy to use. A new player might be a bit scared to use the weapon because you don't have a shield, but if they can make use of this weapon's ability to evade, then they will realize the power of this weapon. Okay, we're stepping into some skill territory here with the Longsword. The mechanics for this weapon requires managing the spirit gauge. Even though it's easy to understand how to get the gauge up, leveling up the gauge might be a little problem with new players. I remember going into panic mode whenever I saw my gauge's level dropping, which diverted my attention and allowed the monster to get a free KO. Those were the noob days. I'll say this weapon's mechanics fall under medium. It's not hard to understand, but maybe in the heat of battle, a new player might find it difficult to maintain. Combos for the Longsword are not hard to understand at all. I would say it's quite straightforward. However, when you factor in the ability to counter with this weapon, that's where it gets a bit tricky. Countering is very useful when using this weapon, and it can be used at almost any point of your combos, which kinda complicates things, which is why I would place this weapon's combo difficulty in medium. For a beginner, the hardest part of doing combos is trying to add in counters, but other than that, the combos are very simple. Overall, this weapon's difficulty fits around medium. I think the thing that will cause problems with the player is being able to time your counters with the longsword. If we're talking about combos without countering, then it's extremely simple. It's just countering that causes problems, because the timing of the counter is dependent on the player's skill, which is why it can be hard for some and it can be easy for others. Also, it involves learning a monster's attack pattern, which can bump up the difficulty quite a bit. The prodding weapon has gone through some changes compared to World or Rise. However, the thing that hasn't changed is that this weapon basically has no mechanic. The only thing that's close to one is the ability to counter. You might think that since it can perform a counter, the mechanic difficulty will increase, right? Well, no. I'd say it's very easy to counter with this weapon. Unlike the longsword, the counter window is easier to perform, which is why the mechanic difficulty of this weapon is easy. In fact, the weapon even auto counters for you, so there's barely any window to counter. There's only one move where if you time the counter right, you get more damage. But other than that, the devs made it really simple to do counters. The lance combos are pretty easy, just spam your thrusts. Obviously, add in some guard counters in the mix, but overall, there's nothing too complicated with the combos. Combo difficulty is easy. Honestly, I'll be surprised if someone were to say it's even in the medium range, but if it is, please explain why. Overall, the poking weapon goes on the easy. The thing that helps it be an easy weapon to use is the auto counter. The weapon's clunky and heavy playstyle might take some time to get used to, but with that massive shield blocking almost any attack, you won't be getting hurt. So there's basically no fear of getting hit when you're trying to use and learn this weapon. It's like having your training wheels when you're learning how to ride a bike. The boomstick has also gone through changes, but the main mechanics of this weapon remains mostly the same. Stuff like the weapon's ability to fire explosives at a close range, the whole wide, normal and long gunlance types, and the rest. This can be quite confusing for someone new, and even I forget which gunlance type makes firing shells weak or strong. It's kinda annoying to be honest, but I'm gonna place the weapon's mechanics under medium. You honestly can just play the gunlance without knowing about the types. However, if you really want to go into the deep end, then knowing about the gunlance types to get the best damage possible would bump up the mechanics to a hard. The combos have gone through the most changes. There's quite a lot of moves that you can chain together to eventually fire this weapon's strongest attack. New players might be overwhelmed with how much you can do with it, or they might stick to one combo. Also, when you factor in some moves that let you perform a guard point, which helps to block attacks while you're doing an attack, can definitely bump this weapon's combo difficulty even more. Which is why I'll put the combos under hard. I even had to go into the training room with this one to understand what the hell I was doing. In the end, with all that I've said, the Gunlance falls under hard. Chaining all the combos, knowing which Gunlance types does what, and performing guard points, if you can, is what pushes this weapon's overall difficulty to hard. The weapon does feel easy at first, but when you learn about all the ways to use the weapon, then it gets a bit complicated. Also, the slow pace of this weapon might catch some people off guard. The simple sword and shield. Well, mechanics are definitely non-existent here, if we're comparing it to other weapons. If I had to really push it, I would probably say the mechanics of this weapon is being able to slash the monster or hit the monster with blunt damage. Slashing the monster can allow you to cut off pieces of the monster, or in other words, it allows you to cut the tail off the monster. Whereas hitting the monster with blunt damage lets you knock out the monster, only if you hit the head, or tire out the monster when hitting anywhere else. Either way, this weapon's mechanics fall under easy, but again, that's me pushing it because in reality, it has no mechanic. Combos actually mess me up to this day. I'm gonna straight up say it's a medium. My reason is because there's so many strings of combos you can do, and picking up this weapon as your starting weapon, you're definitely gonna want to look up a guide for knowing the combos. However, this doesn't mean that this weapon is hard to use. You can totally bottom mash and you'll be somewhat fine. If you know about maybe 50 to 70% of the combos, then you can get away with it. That's why the difficulty drops down from hard to medium. My overall rating is that it's easy to learn. Sure, I don't know how to properly use the combos with this weapon, as you might be able to tell from this video, but that doesn't mean that is a hard weapon to pick up and use as a beginner. Everyone recommends to start with this weapon because it's a mix of the other ones. You have a shield to protect you while you go up close and either slice or bash the monster until you defeat it. Also, sword and shield users will scream at you to learn the combos properly. They've been somewhat screaming at me. The bow has gone through changes that make this weapon way better than it was before, as if it even needed that change. The new mechanic called the trick gauge is another thing that the player will have to manage. This gauge allows you to fire tracer arrows and apply coatings. The gauge can be filled by landing attacks or by performing the discerning dodge, aka perfect evade. Honestly, it's not a hard mechanic to learn, but you still have to manage your stamina when using this weapon, which a new player might find hard. Either way, I'll put this weapon's mechanic under medium. It might even be hard because managing both the stamina and the trick gauge might be difficult. However, the trick gauge isn't too hard to manage, in my opinion. Honestly, I got a bit confused with the bow combos at first, but I just needed to learn the opener and I was good. For the new players, I do wonder what it's like for you guys, to be honest. Okay, my guess is that you most probably are spamming the regular shots and not knowing about using the tracer arrow, the arc shots, and using either the Dragon Piercer or Thousand Dragons. However, it's not too hard to learn about the bow combos. The bow combos fall under medium, it might even be close to hard, but the combos are kinda easy. The bow's overall difficulty goes under medium. It might be a tiny bit hard to use the bow, especially if you want to perform the perfect dodge, maybe managing the gauge, and the stamina bar might be a problem. However, I think it's quite easy to get over that hurdle and use the bow efficiently. A tiny change was made to the light bowgun. The new rapid fire gauge is not complicated at all. It's basically either let it regen without being in the rapid fire mode, or land hits on the monster while in the standard mode. A very simple mechanic for the weapon. Other than that, the weapon remains the same, with it having different ammo types and bowgun mods. I think the only complicated thing when it comes to bowguns in general is the ammo type, because ammos perform better on specific bowguns and new players do not know this. At least the devs had changed the look of the ammo table, which made it much easier to look at than when it was in Monster Hunter World. Anyways, the light bowgun's mechanics fall under medium. It's not hard at all to learn the mechanics, but there's a lot to look at. Combos don't even exist on the light bowgun. The only combo would be the chaser shots and burst step, which can be easily done, so it's easy. I would even place it as non-applicable at this rate. Overall difficulty for the light bowgun is easy. There might be a slight difficulty when it comes to learning to use the right ammo type and which bowgun mods to use, but that barely moves my difficulty scaling even close to a medium. Another tiny change was made to the heavy bowgun. The ignition mode is the new mechanic, and it's the same as the light bowgun's rapid fire mode. You can also perform a perfect guard and an offset attack with this weapon compared to the light bowgun. Other than that, it works just like the light bowgun in terms of ammo type and bowgun mods. This means it's gonna have the same difficulty as the other one, which is medium. Combos are non-existent for sure, it's either easy or non-applicable, which is why I'd say this weapon has the same difficulty as its light counterpart, which is easy. Some people will find the heaviness of the weapon uncomfortable, but making use of the weapon's shield covers its mobility issue. The pogo stick. The mechanics of this weapon can be somewhat confusing and maybe a bit daunting for a new player. There's quite a bit to explain with the mechanics for someone to understand this weapon. Like, I'd have to talk about the Kinsect, which has its own stats. Then there's extracting different essences from the monster and how they can buff you, on top of changing the weapon's movesets. This might overwhelm someone just starting their first Monster Hunter game, so I'm dropping this under hard. On the other hand, this weapon's combos are quite simple. You just have to spam 3 button inputs most of the time. There are a few other moves that you have to remember, like essence extractions, aerial moves, and some other attacks. However, they are not too complicated to remember and they don't really go into a combo. As long as you spam the 3 button inputs, you'll be fine. I would place this under easy. If I had to stretch it, I would say medium because there's quite a bit of moves, but the moves aren't complicated at all. By the way, if you want to know what 3 button inputs I'm talking about, it's basically an infinite combo that I talked about in my 5 tips video for the insect glaive that you might want to watch. My overall rating for the insect glaive is a hard, only because the kinsect mechanics might cause someone's brain to overload while in the heat of battle. However, once someone gets over the hurdle of understanding the mechanics, then learning the combos is a breeze in the park. Maybe I should put this weapon in medium, to be honest. Oh boy, the charge blade. I'm getting flashbacks with the rating I did for this weapon for World. Well, the mechanics will definitely cause someone's brain to blow up. As many veterans of Monster Hunter games would say, this weapon's mechanics are straight up hard. Why is that, you might ask? Well, you got the main mechanic, which is gaining and storing fire energy, then you gotta charge a shield and sword, then there's learning about the power axe mode, and then it's just learning to manage the uptime of powered states of all 3 parts of the weapon. Some new players might find it hard to manage on top of fighting a monster, so that's why it's hard. By the way, we're not done yet. The combos are quite varied that will definitely make a beginner regret picking this as their first weapon. At first, they do seem a bit simple, but there's quite a bit that you can do. Firstly, someone needs to know the attacks you can do in the 2 modes, sword and axe mode. Then it's knowing how guard points can help string your attacks and save your life. Then it's actually pulling it off in battle. A lot of it requires monster knowledge and knowing when to commit to specific moves or combos. Otherwise, you'll just be reckless with weapon like me. So it's definitely safe to say it belongs to the hard difficulty. Overall, I'd be surprised to see if someone says this weapon is easy for a beginner, because without a tutorial on YouTube and just relying on the game's guide, you will miss out on quite a bit of stuff that this weapon has to offer. I'm dropping this weapon under hard because a beginner might drop this game if they use this weapon for their first time, or because they didn't learn to store energy to stop their blade from always bouncing off the monster. And there's quite a bit of combos that you can do with the weapon on top of guard pointing. Moving on to the bonk weapon. The main mechanic is its ability to charge up its attacks, and that's pretty much it. It doesn't really have anything else, and it's extremely simple to learn. You'll mostly be holding down the charge button to do its charge attacks, with each level allowing you to perform specific moves. Therefore, its mechanic is very easy to learn, since I'm literally able to explain its mechanics just right now. Combos, easy. Literally nothing major to learn here. The combos are straightforward, and there's nothing about them that makes them complex. I'll be surprised if someone said otherwise, and if they did, I do hope they can explain what makes the hammer combos complex. Generally, I am interested. Overall, I would still say it's easy, but close to medium. Even though I mostly said everything about this weapon is easy, the thing that I would say that makes it a bit challenging to use is the speed of this weapon. If you're not used to slow weapons like this, then you might find it a problem. Also, there's no shield with this weapon, making you feel quite vulnerable to almost every attack that a monster dishes out, and all you're left with is being able to dodge, which is quite a pain if you're charging up an attack, because every time you dodge while you're charging an attack, you will cancel the charge attack. Also, doing the offset attack is kind of hard to do. The hunting horn mechanics are pretty much the same as before. Different attacks produce different notes, and lining up the notes specifically can create a melody. When you perform the melody, that is when you can get the melody's effect. Sounds pretty simple, but when you're in the heat of battle, that mechanic will confuse you unless you intend to remember each horn's melodies, and there's a lot of them. It's why most people advise to use the melodies before heading into battle. I will say the horns mechanic is hard, but it's kind of leaning to medium, because if you play those melodies before battle, then you don't need to think about the mechanic too much. Combos with this weapon are kind of easy. There isn't really a long combo string, to be honest. The only thing that makes the combos complicated is added additional inputs to create melodies faster. However, that would fall under the weapon's mechanics and not the combos, which is why I'll put the combos under medium. It's kind of hard to judge this one, because if you want a melody, then you're somewhat constricted to doing a specific combo. However, if you're not focusing on melodies, then the combos are easy. In the end, the hunting horn is under hard. If you're trying to do melodies in the middle of battle, you are definitely going to struggle. Plus, each hunting horn has their own melodies, buffs, meaning you have to look carefully to see which one you like to use. And finally, the switch axe. The mechanic might be a bit difficult to manage, but it's pretty easy to understand. Basically, attacking in axe mode increases the big bar, sword mode uses the big bar's energy, the sword mode attacks increases smaller bar, and maxing the small bar makes the weapon do small explosions with each attack. Obviously the bars will run out of energy either through time or using whatever mode. An easy mechanic to understand, but making use of the smaller bar, which is the amp gauge, might be hard to do when the monster is going aggressive. I'm gonna say this is a medium. Combos for the switch axe are interesting because you have to learn both axe or sword mode attacks. You might think it's a bit much to learn because of the two modes, but it's quite simple. I'm gonna say the combo difficulty is medium. That's because there's honestly not a lot of combos to remember in either mode. However, you just have to remember which attacks you can do when you're in one of the modes. My overall rating for the switch axe has to be medium, but it's slightly close to hard. Managing the bars or meters is the only thing that new players will find a bit annoying. Other than that, you do feel quite vulnerable with this weapon, but if you make use of the offset and counter attacks, then you can save your life from those attacks. However, that depends on how good you are at timing your attacks. Now remember, everything I've said here is my opinion, which you can totally agree or disagree on. Just don't get heated over my ratings. I would love to hear your own ratings since it might change my thoughts as well. Be sure to give this video a like, subscribe if you want to continue to see more Wilds content, and I'll see you later.